Greetings on behalf of the New York Society Library. I'm Sarah Holliday, Head of Events. We're honored to present to you author Pamela Newkirk on her book Diversity, Inc. If you'd like to purchase the book or support programs like this one, please see the links on the events webpage. You can search for Newkirk Diversity in the search box at nysoclib.org. Pamela Newkirk is an award-winning journalist and a professor of journalism at New York University, who has written extensively about diversity in the news media and art world. She is also the author of Spectacle, The Astonishing Life of Ota Benga, which won the NAACP Image Award and on which she spoke at the library in 2015, and Within the Veil, Black Journalists, White Media, which won the National Press Club Award for Media Criticism, as well as the editors of Letters from Black America. Newkirk's articles and reviews are regularly published in major media, including the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Guardian, the Nation, and the Chronicle of Higher Education. Our thanks to Professor Newkirk for joining us. Please enjoy and learn from her lecture on Diversity, Inc.
Good evening. I'm delighted to join you today for this virtual talk and thank my friends at the New York Society Library for hosting and for each of you for joining us. And I hope you're somewhere safe and healthy. So I've been asked to discuss the highlights of my book that examines the 5 decades long effort to diversify American institutions. The book is informed by my own experience working both in daily journalism and higher education, 2 realms in which African Americans are radically underrepresented. So for the past 35 years and counting, I've worked both as a professor and spent 10 years in daily journalism. And I wanted to examine why, despite decades of hand-wringing, costly initiatives and uncomfortable conversations, progress in most elite American institutions has stalled and in some cases is in retreat. While racial and ethnic minorities make up nearly 40% of the national population, they comprise just 17% of full-time university professors, which includes faculty at historically Black colleges and universities. So put another way, non-Hispanic whites comprise roughly 61% of the population and hold 83% of full-time professorships, while Hispanics and Blacks, who together comprise 31% of the US population, hold just 3% and 4% respectively of full-time professorships. Their numbers have barely changed in decades. The numbers in academia, like those in other influential fields, are telling. Between 2009 and 2018, the percentage of Black law partners has inched up from 1.7 to 1.8%. People of color comprise 8% of law firm partners, compared to 75% who are white male and 20% who are women. Between 1985 and 2016, the proportion of Black men in management at all US companies with 100 or more employees barely budged from 3% to 3.2%. And between 2004 and 2016, the white composition of corporate board seats has changed little, decreasing from 85.1% to 82.5%. And with the retirement in 2018 of Kenneth Chenault as CEO of American Express, the number of Black Fortune 500 CEOs has decreased to 3. African Americans, who comprise roughly 13% of the US population, are fewer than 1% of Fortune 500 CEOs, and just under 4% of CEOs are Black, Hispanic, or Asian. People of color hold about 14.4% of Fortune 500 board seats. So this underrepresentation defies the quickening pace of change in the nation's racial demographics. In 2011, for the first time in American history, more babies of color were born than non-Hispanic whites. Since 2010, non-Hispanic whites have been the minority in 22 of the nation's 100 largest metropolitan areas, and the U.S. Census Bureau projects that by 2014, they will no longer constitute a national majority. So why? After 5 decades of countless studies, public pledges, and high-profile initiatives, is diversity still lagging in most influential fields? And why is the business of diversity booming, with billions of dollars annually spent on diversity, SARs and consultants, training programs, and climate surveys? And why are the statistics consistently disappointing? I explore diversity across numerous fields, but pay sustained attention to academia, Hollywood, and corporate America, each of which has publicly and privately grappled with the issue over the past 5 decades. They are among the fields whose leaders have in recent years renewed their commitment to diversity, collectively pledging billions of dollars to commission ever more studies, set up training sessions, and hire consultants and czars to oversee diversity programs. So it's impossible to understand diversity without exploring the big business of it, the tension between the rhetoric and the expenditures, and the chronically disappointing results. Our current diversity conversation grew out of the 1960s civil rights movement and President Johnson's efforts through his Great Society programs to fold African Americans into American institutions which had long excluded them. Since that time, diversity, of course, has been expanded to encompass other racial and ethnic minorities, along with women, people with physical and mental disabilities, gender, sexual orientation, and other marginalized populations. Indeed, there's little agreement on what diversity even means. A survey of 771 chief diversity officers at colleges and universities found that 63% had difficulty even arriving at a common definition for diversity on their campus. Ideas range from simply valuing difference to social justice for those who have been historically excluded and disadvantaged. In 2018, Denise Young Smith, Apple's first ever vice president of inclusion and diversity, took the ever-evolving definition to its seemingly logical conclusion when on a panel on diversity, she suggested that 12 blonde-haired, blue-eyed white men could also illustrate diversity due to their different backgrounds. When asked whether she would focus on underrepresented minorities and specifically Black women, Smith, who is Black, responded, quote, "I focus on everyone. Diversity is the human experience. I get a little frustrated when diversity is tagged to people of color or the women or the LGBT," close quote. So the elasticity of the term has rendered it, along with the goals that it's intended to accomplish, opaque and therefore unattainable. As diversity for many institutions becomes untethered from the history and legacy of racial injustice, it has eclipsed the plight of racial minorities in general and African Americans in particular. Overlooked too are the ways in which racial minorities become doubly and triply burdened by interlocking systems of discrimination related to physical and cognitive disability, gender, sexual orientation. So in Diversity, Inc., I specifically explore the issue of racial diversity and focus on the 3 largest racial and ethnic minority groups, namely Hispanics or Latinx, African Americans or Black, and Asian Americans, even as the stark disparities between Blacks and whites remains the most illuminating indicator of America's racial breach. and examining the data and conversing with scores of people on the front lines of the movement for change, I discovered some of the reasons why, despite decades of deliberation and costly initiatives, many are still pondering and gesturing rather than meaningfully increasing racial diversity. While these are complex issues that are not easily boiled down to bullet points, I will nonetheless attempt to outline some of the factors that can contribute to the current diversity landscape and what individuals and institutions might do differently to achieve racial diversity. So here are the 5 biggest takeaways from my research that help explain why institutions have not made greater strides after 5 decades of ostensibly trying. Number 1, first and foremost, is the legacy of racial hierarchies stamped into our educational system and therefore the American DNA. This enduring ideology of white preeminence that permeates mass media, so-called high art, the Western literary canon, and education curricula from grade school through higher education. The dismal numbers reported year after year are a predictable outcome of embedded racial attitudes and dominant narratives that define our culture. Much of the unrest we've seen on college campuses in recent years is a reaction to the ways in which this ethos is expressed in the composition of the faculty and student body, in the campus iconography, and the racial illiteracy and historical amnesia that pervades the curriculum. In the wake of tragic events in Charlottesville, Kurt Van Dock, a history professor and assistant dean at the University of Virginia, said that 2017 was a wake-up call for white America, which had not seriously confronted the vexed history of race. He said, quote, "Charlottesville is known as a white progressive place, but there's a pretty unpleasant story dealing with slavery and segregation. What we're wrestling with is a microcosm of what America has not come to terms with since the Civil Rights Movement. It so powerfully shapes the world we're in," close quote. So white denial about the ways in which the past continues to inform the present, the mistaken belief by many that racial equality has been achieved, is perhaps the biggest impediment to diversity. It perverts how many institutions define excellence, merit, scholarship, and how they set institutional priorities. We're left with curricula that often fail to acknowledge how racial illiteracy and airbrush history have impoverished our class offerings, undermined students' capacity for empathy, and left Americans ill-equipped to grasp the underlying causes of persisting racial disparities and injustice. Institutions cannot hope to achieve true diversity without meaningfully addressing the ways in which their own history so palpably informs the present. The debates over public iconography, whether in Virginia or in New York or on Ivy League campuses, is less about relics than they are about the values and ideas that they express today. Number 2 is social networks and custom. We live in a rigorously segregated society. People in the academy, in Hollywood, and corporate America, like those in other influential fields, often hire people from their own small social and professional networks. We hire who we know, who our friends know. For example, at colleges and universities, faculty search committees generally have wide latitude to reach out to anyone they deem suitable or desirable to join the faculty. Hiring then is a subjective process, and finalists typically mirror the network of those leading the search. Searches often result in the hiring of friends and former colleagues or people whose backgrounds, scholarly interests, and sensibilities mirror those of the committee members. The candidates then tend to reflect the overwhelmingly white composition of the faculty. Add to this process of self-referential decision-making the network of influential people who are then asked to write letters of recommendation, which leaves all but a small number of racial minorities out of the loop. For junior level prospective candidates whose scholarship challenges white norms and views embedded in Euro-centered canons, the odds are especially long. Moreover, once institutions do prioritize diversity, many attempt to recruit the same cadre of proven stars in their fields while overlooking emerging people of color in the pipeline. As a result, the same superstars of color are recycled, moving between institutions while the overall number of people of color remains unchanged. The bidding wars over a handful of token stars further stokes resentment among some whites while fueling the perception that racial minorities are the ones who receive preferential treatment. And on boards, for example, instead of expanding the number of African Americans, many companies recruit the same small number of people who serve on multiple boards. It's a vicious cycle that for decades has helped maintain the status quo. Number 3, failed diversity practices. While many institutions have in recent years hired chief diversity officers and instituted diversity programs, there's a growing body of scholarship that suggests that much of the training mandated by thousands of institutions doesn't work and in some instances do more harm than good. Quote, strategies for controlling bias, which drives most diversity efforts, have failed spectacularly. Harvard professor Frank Dobbin and Tel Aviv professor Alev Alexandra concluded in their study why diversity programs failed, that was published in the Harvard Business Review in 2016. Noting the lack of progress in management of Black men since 1985 and white women since 2000, they wrote, quote, it isn't that there aren't enough educated women and minorities out there. Both groups have made huge educational gains over the past 2 generations. The problem is that we can't motivate people by forcing them to get with the program and punishing them if they don't, close quote. Dobbin and Alexandra, both professors of sociology, examined 3 decades of data from 800 US firms and interviewed hundreds of managers and executives. They found that mandatory training, which they described as command and control approaches, often trigger a backlash, particularly among white men. Rather than being converted, they often react with anger and resistance. Even more troubling is the adverse impact mandatory training appears to have on those it's intended to help. 5 years after instituting training, they found that on average, the number of Black women in management dropped 9.2%, and the number of Asian women and men dropped 5.4 and 4.3% respectively. Another study, Prejudice Reduction, What Works, a review and assessment of research, is one of the most comprehensive on the efficacy of diversity programs. It examined 893 published and unpublished reports of interventions intended to reduce prejudice over a 5-year period. The interventions included workplace diversity initiatives, multicultural education, dialogue groups, media campaigns, and cognitive training intended to combat bias related to a wide range of targets, including race, religion, age, weight, and attitudes towards diversity and multiculturalism. According to the authors, Elizabeth Levy Pollock and Donald P. Green, quote, The strongest conclusion to be drawn from the field experimental literature on prejudice reduction concerns the dearth of evidence for most prejudice reduction programs, they said. They continued, quote, few programs originating in scientific laboratories, nonprofit or educational organizations, government bureaus, and consulting firms have been evaluated rigorously. And they added that entire genres of interventions, including organizational diversity training, advertising, cultural competence in the health and law professions, and education have not been tested. One can argue, they wrote, that diversity training workshops succeed because they break down stereotypes and encourage empathy. Alternatively, one can argue that such workshops reinforce stereotypes and elicit resistance among the most prejudiced participants. Neither of these conflicting arguments is backed by the type of evidence that would convince a skeptic. So they concluded, quote, we currently do not know whether a wide range of programs and policies tend to work on average, and we are quite far from having an empirically grounded understanding of the conditions under which these programs work best. So Pollack and Green found that the positive effects of diversity training at best last a day or two, and even then can trigger backlash. So there's little evidence that the initiatives most commonly employed by most institutions work, and we see the numbers are not changing. Yet, they continue to spend billions each year with little or nothing to show for it, which begs the question, why are institutions doing the same thing and expecting different results? Number 4, the diversity backlash. Following the civil rights movement, America had begun to make tremendous progress towards closing the racial gap in income and education. However, by the end of the 1970s, affirmative action gave way to cries of reverse discrimination. In 1978, in Bakke versus University of California, the U.S. Supreme Court narrowly ruled in favor of Alan Bakke, a white student who sued the University of California Medical School for reserving 16 out of 100 seats for racial minorities. In a 5-4 decision, the U.S. Supreme Court struck down the use of racial quotas in college admissions, saying they violated the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. Writing for the majority, Supreme Court Justice Lewis Powell explained, quote, there is a measure of inequity in forcing innocent persons in Bakke's position to bear the burdens of redressing grievances not of their making, close quote. The ruling meant that past discrimination of disadvantaged groups could no longer be considered in admission decisions. The Bakke decision was followed in 1981 with the dismantlement of federal anti-discrimination programs under the Reagan administration. Affirmative action continued to be vilified even after quotas were eliminated. By the 1980s, many of the gains made during the 1960s and 70s, including school integration, were erased, along with federal policies that had begun to effectively close the education and poverty gap, all the while without whites losing ground. The backlash extended beyond education, as historian Carol Anderson recounts in White Rage, Black unemployment had sharply declined during the 1960s and 70s, nearly closing the racial gap. However, under the Reagan administration, federal jobs and education programs that had aided that progress were slashed, causing Black unemployment to skyrocket to 15.5%, the highest it had been since the Great Depression. Black youth unemployment rose to 45.7%. Reagan then slashed the training, employment, and labor services budget by 70%, causing college enrollment among African Americans to fall from 34% to 26%. Thus, Anderson writes, just at the moment when the post-industrial economy made an undergraduate degree more important than ever, 15,000 fewer African Americans were in college during the 1980s than had been the case in the mid-1970s, she wrote. So these attacks had an immediate effect on the diversity of colleges and on their student bodies. After California's passage in 1996 of Proposition 209, which abolished affirmative action programs in state hiring, contracting, and college admissions, minority admissions plummeted 61% at UC Berkeley and 36% at UCLA. Similarly, the percentage of Rice University's freshman class dropped 36% after Texas eliminated affirmative action programs. More recently, in Fisher versus University of Texas, the Supreme Court was once again asked to intervene in race-based admission policies after Abigail Fisher, a white student, sued after she was denied admission. In its defense, the university cited a 2002 study showing that 79% of university courses had one or no African Americans enrolled, and 30% had one or no Hispanics. In 2013, the Supreme Court upheld the university's use of race, but cited a standard of strict scrutiny, which requires the university to prove to the court that race-neutral policies were attempted. I spoke to Columbia University President Lee Bollinger, and he said that diversity has become an abstract concept due to the Supreme Court's Bakke decision, which of course prevents universities from seeking remedies for past discrimination, even though it is precisely the legacy of history that affirmative action policies attempt to address. Quote, "We're deprived of the context that gave it a sense of mission," Bollinger said. Quote, "Every college leader is told, do not refer to history. I think we have a meaningless, abstract conversation about diversity without a rationale." Close quote. The ongoing backlash to diversity continues to undermine progress. The universities of Tennessee and Nebraska are among the state universities that have sought to defund or downsize diversity programs. Last year, Mark Perry, a white economics professor at the University of Michigan, filed a complaint with the Department of Education Office of Civil Rights against Wayne State University for hosting a summer workshop for Black Girls Code, a nonprofit that seeks to address the virtual absence of Black women in the burgeoning tech industry. Number 5, leadership. Diversity, or the lack thereof, is a leadership issue. While the diversity apparatus, the task forces, studies, officers, consultants, suggest that achieving diversity is rocket science, my research shows that it is primarily something that requires committed leadership and intention. Instead, many institutional leaders have farmed the problem out to consultants and to diversity officers who are often marginalized within the institutions they serve. Said Bollinger, quote, "You have to believe in a principle of justice. There hasn't been enough pushback on the abstraction of diversity. You have to make it front and center. I think it's a matter of intention. If it's a pipeline issue, you have to work on the pipeline. The entire institution has to be behind it." Close quote. Bollinger says it really comes down to valuing diversity as something that's good for society. Quote, "I think you have to have a civil rights consciousness in order to have this really work. You have to believe in a principle of justice. Every institution should speak to this. Instead, we've hidden from it. We talk about diversity as if it's detached from this history. I would urge everyone to say it because it needs to be said. I think we've allowed this loss of memory to take hold, and the people who oppose it to set the agenda. Close quote. So I've spent most of the time explaining why we don't have greater racial diversity in most of our institutions. And I'd like to close with the good news, and that's that there are successful models that can be replicated. In Diversity Inc., I devote several chapters to some of those models, one being what happened at the Coca-Cola Company after it settled a landmark discrimination lawsuit. Over the course of 5 years, and with a system of transparent metrics and accountability, it was able to detect and disrupt patterns of bias that had begun to metastasize in its hiring, promotion, salary, evaluation, and bonus decisions. But with vigilance and the ability to hold managers accountable for their decisions, around promotions and salaries and hiring, before they were finalized, they were able to ensure racial equity. By the end of 5 years, the company had managed to hire and promote a far greater number of African Americans, women, and other marginalized groups while improving the racial climate in the workplace. There are other strategies. The Rooney Rule, which is a rule that requires the candidate pool to include racial minorities and women. There are so many other strategies. Mentoring, which is one of the most undervalued ways to both increase and retain diversity in the workplace. But oftentimes, because of discomfort around race, many people of color are left on their own without mentors in the workplace. And of course, there's just the simple matter of institutions just expanding their outreach to professional networks that of color that are often overlooked. But as I noted in that fifth point, none of these strategies are likely to bear fruit without committed leadership and intention. As Bollinger said, quote, "Left to its own devices, it won't happen." And with that, I'll close and thank you. And I look forward to engaging your questions during the Q&A.